Hey friends, we're just going to run the announcements here for a second. Well, I thought it was. Hey everybody, it's Amie Register. Ooh. Trying to figure out my fun little thing here. But oh my goodness. Sorry guys. I put something up on the screen and now I don't know how to take it out. Well, this is no fun. I did this last night and now I feel like a fool. Anyway.
No, not at all.
Oh my goodness.
Do you want to switch?
Guys, just bear with me for a minute. I'm trying to think if there's a thing that okay, I had two overlays up there, not just one, so I was deleting one. Hey, sorry, let me try that again. Hi, I'm Amie Register from Ask a Christian, and to my right is my dear friend.
I am Mark.
Dear
Amie
friend.
Register.
Yes.
My dear friend, Amie Register.
Anyway, sorry about that. I just want to do a quick review. If you've just joined us, if tonight's your first night, we've been talking about who is Jesus of Nazareth. We've gone through the sources that we have for figuring out who this guy was, and we've gone through some of his character traits. Tonight, we're going to talk about Jesus and his humble leadership and growing up in the church. I heard a lot about how loving and kind and humble Jesus was. And it wasn't until I was older that I thought, well, we've got a few collections of, stories in the gospel, but how do we really know, first of all, if that's true? And second of all, it just, it took a little while for me to come around to the idea of the gospels being any kind of historical, just because I knew that the Bible was so biased from the Christian perspective. So anyway, that's part of my own journey, but kind of arriving on the other side of it, finding out that even if a source is biased, we don't throw that out. In fact, if we were to do that, we would have very little information on who Jesus was.
I think just speaking in history, there'll be very little information, period. Like no one comes to anything without any kind of bias.
Right. So plugging that back in and looking at Jesus kind of as an adult outside of the Sunday school or Sabbath school stories that I heard, and finding some good stuff. But before I get into what the Gospels say about Jesus, I wanted to read a couple quotes to you that had my attention, even in my teenage years. The first one is contested. I was always interested in Napoleon. I think ever since somebody told me that somebody had Napoleon syndrome, and I figured out what that was. He was a little tiny guy with a big hat, and he acted bigger than his britches. I just thought history was cool, and so interested in some of the things that Napoleon wrote after he was not a conqueror, after he was not a big man on campus. So this is from a pamphlet that he supposedly wrote or compiled when he was in discussions with his friends on the nature of the divinity of Christ. I'm not going to try to say it in French, but I will post it in the links. So here's the quote. It says, Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and I have founded empires, but on what did we rest the creation of our genius? Upon force. Jesus Christ founded his empire upon love, and at this hour, millions of men would die for him. So I always thought that was interesting that this great at one time hero and conqueror, and of course, as I said, it's contested, but there's good reason to believe that he did think on the nature of who Jesus was as well. So we're at least in good company on that. And then there are parts of that that's contested, whether or not he called Jesus the Christ and a couple other things, but very interesting quote. And then another one from historian and political theorist W.H. Lecky. The character of Jesus has not only been the highest pattern of virtue, but the strongest incentive in its practice, and has exerted so deep an influence that it may be truly said that the simple record of 3 years of active life has done more to regenerate and soften mankind than all the disquisitions of philosophers and all the exhortations of moralists. So just some quotes that as I was coming into figuring out who I was, who I wanted to model my life after, I just thought, okay, well, here's some quotes from some interesting people, and they had my attention. Okay, so why do people believe that Jesus was loving? I'm sure you can think of some examples that you heard growing up, whether you are religious, not religious, whatever faith background that you come from. You might have heard a thing or two about Jesus and some of the things that people say about him. So I would love to hear why you believe that Jesus was loving, kind, or humble, or had a good character at all. I wanted to say that there is very little direct evidence or direct, what do you call it? Accounts, eyewitness accounts of Jesus outside the Bible.
Even as you were saying that initially, as far as what we believed, I was thinking, and I was like, all of my things come back
to the Bible, right? Yeah. So looking at that from any other perspective than the Gospels is difficult, but and the stuff that we do have is actually negative. So that's what I found really funny. I'm gonna read something to you about the Gospel of Thomas. So, or it's called the infancy Gospel of Thomas. In the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is one of those apocryphal writings that we talked about earlier in the series, which just means that it's from the faith community or appears to be,
right,
but it doesn't have the same level of authenticity that the Gospels do. So this is called Infancy Gospel of Thomas. It says, Jesus is represented as naughty, irascible, vindictive child who uses his miraculous powers to take revenge on teachers, neighbors, and other children, some of whom he blinds, cripples, or even kills. Like, there's a reason that didn't get in the canon, but it's not just because we didn't like it. Like, people do put things in things do get in the story of Jesus that Christians are embarrassed of. But this one, they're just like, well,
this seems so far outside the range of being credible.
Yeah. So, but it's definitely.
But it is enlightening.
It's ancient. It's historical. It's enlightening.
It lets us know what some people were saying or were thinking to say at that time. So it definitely still has value, I would say. It just, even though it has value compared to other sources that we have or know, it's like, wow, this seems so different.
Yeah, it was really far off. So the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Truth are other apocryphal writings that were found in the Nag Hammadi library. And they are not narrative stories like we have in the Gospels, but they have collections of sayings about how Jesus was a wise teacher. And sometimes those sayings contradict sayings in the Christian Bible. So again, not because Christians just didn't like them, but because they went through a rigorous test. You shared some of those things that make something historical or kind of, well, not historical, but factual or more certain. But those got dismissed.
I'm so curious, not to hop in here, but I'm just like, I would love to see what some of those sayings are. Like, I know we have other documents as far as sayings attributed to Jesus, but I would love, I mean, we might not get into it tonight, but just.
Or they hate your neighbor.
Right.
Or, yeah. You have heard it said. Yeah. So those extra biblical sources even contest some of the Gospels on who Jesus is, or that he had a kind character, but they were also not very authentic in scholars' eyes. So they got dismissed. And there's some other negative things said about Jesus. And for a long time, not just for like a few years or at the beginning of Christianity, but in the 1st through the 4th century, especially, and even beyond in some areas, Christianity had a big PR problem. And from the Roman perspective, the Christians who were, meeting, eating and drinking together, taking what we now call communion, to these people, to these Roman authorities, it sounded like cannibalism. And it sounded like cannibalism when Jesus mentioned it in the New Testament. And he said, hey,
this is my body.
This is my body. Eat this. Yeah. This is my blood. We don't realize today, because we understand the symbolism, but we don't realize how hard that would have hit that would hit harshly on these Roman ears. They had their own mystery cults. They had their own things they were dealing with, even in pagan Romanism, that were frowned upon. They had some of these, strange mystery cults that were, dabbling in cannibalism and stuff themselves. So for them to hear that Christians were doing it was just like, okay, first of all, they believed that these guys were atheists. They called them atheists because they believed in one God instead of many.
And a God that you couldn't even see.
And a God that you couldn't even see, my goodness. And then here they are doing these things. So some of the early commentary on Christians even is really negative. Governor Pliny, I don't know how you say his name. I've said Pliny.
I've heard Pliny.
I've said Pliny. Pliny probably sounds more correct. But anyway, so this governor is hearing all these bad things about Christians. And then he writes to Emperor Trajan for advice on how to deal with these crazy Christian atheist cannibals. And so one of the first outside sources we have on Christianity and what it really looked like from an outsider's perspective is from around, it's barely into the 2nd century, 1st century, about 112 AD. So it says, they asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing a hymn to Christ as a God and bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but to not commit fraud, theft, adultery, not to falsify their trust, not to refuse to return trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and assemble again to partake of food. And this is why I think this quote is funny, because now you know the gossip about them. Ordinary and innocent food, he tells the emperor. It's just ordinary food. They're not eating people. Even this they affirmed they had ceased to do after my edict, by which, in accordance with your instructions, I had forbidden political associations. Accordingly, I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing two female slaves who were called deaconesses. But I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition. So this letter to Trajan is negative in their eyes, but positive for Christianity.
It's just funny, and you highlighted it, but it's funny to me that the need is felt, and I guess, and is there to say, no, it's just ordinary food, nothing special about it, nothing crazy. And the fact that he so casually mentions, and to make sure that this was the truth, I tortured a couple of people along the way, didn't learn anything. It's just like, and it just is mentioned, it's all mentioned so casually, but how bad must you look in this time that's like, look, I have to mention you guys are eating nothing out the ordinary. And I also have to mention that, hey, we tortured some people, but you guys passed the smell test. Like, you must really, like you said, a bad PR problem.
Yeah. So this quote is not really contested. It's really historically firm. And so that gives us kind of our first hint, even though we can't tell a whole lot about Jesus himself. If we can tell what his followers were up to really close after he was gone, then we have a sense of what he was about, what they were about.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, this one's sad and funny at the same time, but it gives us a hint into what Christians were like and Christian life was like in the first century. Now, here's another non-contested source, and it's just a few years later. And it says, about AD 130. Here's a quote. It's in a letter to Diogenes. Is that how you say it?
That's how I've heard it.
I don't know how to say these words. I'm just going out there. Feel free to correct me with your pronunciation guides.
I've learned when you don't know, just say it strongly and confidently and normal questioning.
Diogenes.
Sounds good to me.
I don't know. Okay. They dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens, they share in all things with others and yet endure all things as if foreigners. A little insight into how foreigners were treated as well, unfortunately. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, every land of their birth as a land of strangers. They marry, as do all others. They beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. Okay, so that makes me laugh because that must have been either another rumor or something else that another people group did, that they're making a distinction. Here's what early Christians do.
The things that people mention, as far as historically, the things that people mention and they don't mention, it gives you an insight into what's going on either like with that group or in the culture of that day.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad you said that because this next one, that's the first half of this quote. The second is they have a common table, but not a common bed. What? Who? Okay.
Goodness.
Yeah, getting back to some of those Essenes, the Essenes had some strange practices that are questionable. So they are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws and at the same time surpass the laws by their lives. Okay, this person is pretty friendly towards Christianity. They love all men and are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet make many rich. They are in lack of all things and yet abound in all. They are dishonored, and yet in their very dishonor are glorified. Wrapping this up, they are evil spoken of and yet justified. They are reviled and blessed. So they are reviled and they still bless others. They are insulted and repay the insult with honor. They do good yet are punished as evildoers. When punished, they rejoice as if quickened into life. They are assailed by the Jews as foreigners and persecuted by the Greeks. Yet those who hate them are unable to assign any reason for their hatred. Glowing reports of the Christians.
Almost too friendly. I'm like, wow,
yeah,
it
is. And I think, while the historicity of this is pretty intact, you could argue that it was poetic in nature and that, there's a little hyperbole here. But this person had a great experience with an early Christian. And so if this is what Christianity looks like then, and by the way, I sure wish that somebody would say the same thing about Christians today, and that those of us who count ourselves among their number, we're living like that. If that's what they're saying, if they're dealing with persecution and, repaying dishonor with honor, then that speaks to their leader. So that just kind of answered some of my personal questions when I was younger and kind of growing into the Jesus thing, and wondering what he was like. Here's the last one that I'll give, and it's my favorite one because it's so solid in history and it's so interesting. I love reading about Julian the Apostate. Do you know who that guy was? It's not a quiz. I'm not going to ask you anything else. Have you heard of him?
I have heard of him, yes.
Okay.
I didn't know if there's gonna be a follow-up, so I was like, I don't want too many.
I know, I do that too. Have you seen it? Yeah. What's it about? Ooh, I don't know. But in the 300s, Emperor Constantine supposedly became a Christian and legalized Christianity for the Roman Empire.
Why do you say supposedly?
Well, a lot of people question his conversion, whether it was real or not. He brought on some coercive things about it. So it's like, now I'm a Christian, but I also still want to do these other things, believe these other things. So I don't know. What do you think? You want to take a side note?
Oh, no.
We'll take a trip.
I'm with you 100%. Not that I'm in the business of judging somebody's,
right,
but based off of the things that were married together and the things he still did. And
yeah,
it wasn't even a deathbed confession. Like, it was like, okay, this just seems quite opportunistic. So I agree with you. Supposedly, I found it humorous.
Oh yeah, maybe it sounds rude. If you told me that you converted to Christianity, I would not say supposedly before it, just to make that clear. It's just that there's a lot written about his life that doesn't seem to add up. So
I was gonna say, just go read it for yourself. And you'll see why it says supposed. And maybe you'll have your own judgment, but look at Constantine's life beforehand, and
you can be real messed up and me still think you're a Christian. That's not much of it. Anyway, okay, but then not even, like a generation later, his nephew, Julian, who I think it's rude that they call him Julian the Apostate, but I'm just going to keep on with it because clearly he did not continue on with Christianity. So that's what the early Christian church called him and labeled him. So I'm picking it up just so you know who I'm talking about, because you can't just Google Julian, but Google Julian the Apostate. Anyway, okay, this is around 362 CE, nephew of Constantine who legalized Christianity. He wrote a letter to the pagan high priest, here's another name I don't know how to say, Erasius, lamenting. Let me read this to you. It is disgraceful that when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans, or Christians, support not only their own poor, but ours as well, all men see that our people lack aid from us. Another letter, these impious Galileans not only feed their own poor, but ours as well, welcoming them into their agape, kind of love feasts, or, that sounds real creepy, but, Christian potlucks where everybody would take care of those who had need and make sure that everybody was fed. So welcoming them into their agape, welcoming them into their, their circle of care and trust. And here's what gets me. For those of you who like cake, it says, they attract them as children are attracted by cakes. He means it as a slap in the face. He means it distastefully. Like, of course, every kid runs to sweets. But it's beautiful.
To piggyback off the point you made earlier, if Christians today attracted people, like, what?
Can you guys hear Mark? I know. No, I'm saying this because a our friend is playing music in the background, and I don't know how much of it's coming through this mic. So anyway, if Mark's too quiet, just let us know. Or if I'm too quiet, let us know.
It won't be the first time.
All right. So in summary, Romans had unfavorable views of Christians and Christianity, but we can laugh at it because it actually seems fairly favorable to me, what they end up saying. They didn't like them, and their complaints against them were, especially in the case of Julian, like, oh man, their stuff's working too well. Their social justice programs are so helpful. We can't win. Meh. And there's tons of stuff like that from Julian. So it's actually, he's quite a good source to figure out what Christianity was up to in the 2nd century. Okay, so but back to Jesus, because that's really what this whole thing is about. There are tons of things in the Bible about his character and about how good and kind and noble and generous he was. And there's some fun things in there that, like we talked about last night, where Jesus could be interpreted fully different than that, just a wordsmith and making multiple meanings. But there are plenty of things where we can get that kindness, that softness, that patience. So I want to look at just a few examples tonight. I also want to check and see if my friend Chad is on. He is not on yet. Will you text Chad Reed and see if he's coming on tonight?
Sure thing.
So let's look in the Gospels, our source for tonight on the life of Jesus. And if you've got a digital Bible, or if you got one with you, or you just want to make a note, you can turn to Matthew 22:37. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." He said, all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. Now, this is probably not going to blow your mind, but Jesus spoke a lot about loving and loving your neighbor. And it doesn't seem like it'd be revolutionary, except that we've talked a little bit about how interested the Pharisees were in their laws. 600 plus laws surrounding the 10 laws that we believe God gave at Mount Sinai. And so all of these laws, 600 plus laws, Jesus comes in and he reduces them down to 2. If you loved your laws, if that was the distinctive thing that made you who you were, that kept you separate,
and that can be very happy.
It doesn't seem like like you would like it too well. And so this is revolutionary because the Jewish teachers, Jesus is not just saying, all the 600, they don't matter. He's not just saying, look to the 10. He's saying, even within that, there are 2 principles that should guide our lives, and that is love God and love others. And so, yeah, that was revolutionary, that he was known for stuff like that, but it was centered in love. So that's one phrase and one theme that is kind of repeated through Jesus's life. And then I wanted to also mention John 3:16, which is, if you know one Bible verse, if you've learned to recite one Bible verse, it's usually John 3:16, which says, "For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life." Yada, 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 you say. You've heard it 1,000 times. But this is revolutionary, especially for the Jews, because they believed that they were chosen and set apart. And that was such a big part of their culture, such a big part of who they were as Jewish people, that God loved them best, that he chose them for a specific purpose.
God called
them. But here's the thing. They had forgotten what the point of him calling them was. It wasn't to pick out the best and the shiniest and to set them up on a pedestal and say, hey, everybody, look at them. He picked them up and set them on a pedestal because they were supposed to follow after him, to follow after his laws, his ways, his statutes, to be a people of love. And so they had forgotten that. So when God says that he did love everyone, that he loved the world, this is revolutionary to the Jewish peoples in the audience. They're like, oh, yeah.
I think it's also revolutionary because it shows them God could have picked anybody as well. Like,
right.
There was nothing before you were called to do this great thing that set you apart. You were set apart because I set you apart. And so it's radical, I think, in a couple of ways, but don't want to get ahead of you.
No, that's great. They, so the point is that this was a statement of inclusion, that the people hearing, for God so loved the world, that whosoever believes in him, they would have bristled a bit at it. And, we just take it for granted that this is God being loving, but he was actually turning something over that had been existing for thousands of years, which was this look at me mentality. God chose us. We're special. But the question is, why did God choose you? He chose you to show his love to everyone. And so his love was put on display there in kind of a revolutionary way. Let's see. Oh, I didn't realize until probably a couple of years ago that this God so loved the world verse was in Nicodemus's hearing, right?
Oh yeah, the story within the story.
Yeah, I had forgotten that. So Nicodemus was actually one of the few Jewish leaders, like high up, that seemed to really like and seek after Jesus. And so if he was in the crowd, he would have been just like, what? Jaw dropped. I put that in my notes and forgotten to mention it. Another couple verses I wanted to mention, like obviously zero time to go through this tonight and say all the good, loving things that Jesus said.
Right.
That are in the Gospels that we know of. But in Mark 9:35, Jesus said the phrase that kind of kicked off the naming of this session, which is, if anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and the servant of all. And I went to a Christian elementary school, and I cannot tell you how much I did not like that verse when it came to lining up for recess or lunch or whatever it was, because you get there first and then the kid, with the super religious parents at home, it's like, just tell them if they do that the first shall be last. So we always got that in line. So I hated it.
I think our schools might be fairly similar.
And then very similar to this verse is in Luke 14, the one who is least among you, this is the one who is great. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So those are some of the words of Jesus that were revolutionary for the time, that did show extreme love and humbleness and leadership. If it were just words, though, I wouldn't be as interested or as convinced. So I want to look with you at some of Jesus' actions as well. I want to look at just a couple of verses from a chapter in John 13. And as you turn there, if you're going to turn there, I want to give you some background leading up to these verses, because we don't have time to read the whole story. And so I'm going to read you some of the bullet points that I wrote down going into this story. So at this time, Jesus and his 12 disciples are in the upper chamber of a home in Jerusalem, getting ready for the Passover feast. It's the feast that commemorates the Israelites being set free from Egyptian captivity. The angel of God passed over homes, And whoever had the blood of a lamb on their doorpost would be spared, but those who did not would lose the firstborn in their family. That ended up being the final straw for the Egyptian Pharaoh and finally set the captives free. So a super, super meaningful feast, a super meaningful time. And Jesus knows that what he came to do, which we'll talk more about in the next couple of nights, what he came to do was at hand. So he believed he was the Passover lamb. He believed that he was going to be put to death on the day of the feast. And he believed that he was the Messiah and that if people accepted his sacrifice, they would be saved from the consequences of sin. Right. So that is to let you know the weight of what's about to go down. Jesus knew that he would be deserted and betrayed in his hour of need. So the disciples noticed his solemn spirit during this supper that they were having, and they were preoccupied with arguments about who was going to be the most important when Jesus set up his kingdom, because Jesus had been talking about this new kingdom, and they're like, yeah, I'm in. I'm going to sit at the right hand. I'm going to sit at the left hand. And they were squabbling about it. To make matters worse, as they sat down to eat their meal, there was nobody present, no servant present to help them wash their feet, as was the custom before the meal times. And they continue squabbling. Each of them kind of has a feeling that maybe they should jump up and serve each other. As I just read, Jesus had been teaching this mentality to them while he was hanging out with them. Right. If you want to be the first in the kingdom, make yourself a humble servant. It's not like this was their first opportunity, but it was an important opportunity. So this is the background for Jesus' decision for himself to get up and wash his disciples' feet. This is probably one of the most famous scenes in the Bible. So Jesus gets up and humbly washes the feet of his disciples. And mind you, not just the men who loved him, but there was a man named Judas who was about to go and betray him for some silver in his pocket. And he had already sold him out to his enemies. So here's where the torch is passed. Here's the challenge. Here's where I believe Christ really birthed Christianity. Jump in, Mark. Stop me.
I think just the magnitude of this moment. Like I'm thinking through the things that you've ran us through. Mm-hmm. The leader's feeling somber. Like, you know, he's very sober in his thoughts, knowing what's going to happen. Yeah. The people he's been walking with, teaching, are there acting like children, not reading the room as far as, hey, right. He's kind of going through something, but he's like, okay, I'm above the fray. There's somebody in there that he knows is going to betray him and does not love him. Mm-hmm. And despite all that, as a leader, he's like, all right, I've got to sit here and get past this and still sit here and show them what this thing is really about. I don't know. I think for me, just when I slow it down, I'm like, wow, that's a leader unlike any other. But
yeah, I think, you know, I don't want to speak for you, but I'll speak for you. We consider ourselves pretty decent humans, you know, when we compare ourselves to, no, I'm just kidding. We do. We consider ourselves decent humans. I'm sure if you're watching this, you'd be in that boat. I would have a hard time washing the feet or showing humbleness and grace to somebody who I knew was about to do anything evil to me. Not take away that it has to do with my life or death.
Right.
Like somebody selling me out in a boardroom. Somebody selling me out, like if I knew you were about to. Once it's already done, then we can talk about forgiveness. But pre-forgiveness is something entirely different to me. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I'm
like, don't you dare.
I'm with you 110%. Yes, I know this thing 110%. Yes.
So this is where I think my heart was interested in Jesus in this part of the story, because putting myself in that situation, I really can't get there very well. And I think it takes a superhuman understanding to look at somebody who's about to do you wrong and be like, I get it though. I get it. And he does this here. He also does this at the cross, which we will not have time to talk about. But he is not holding those who are physically harming him responsible for what's going on at all. He's not mad at all, according to the gospel message. So Judas had already left, Judas had already betrayed him, and in his mind and heart, and was leaving to meet the men who were on their way to arrest Jesus. So knowing that, he gives this last address to them in John 13. He says, "Children," and I don't think he said it in a snotty tone.
No.
Children. He uses that as a heartfelt phrase.
Term of effect, like a term of endearment or
Yeah.
affection.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Oh yeah.
"I am with you only a short time longer. You're going to look high and low for me, but just as I told the Jews, I'm telling you, where I go, you are not able to come. Let me give you a new command. Love one another. In the same way I loved you, love one another. This is how everyone will recognize that you are my disciples, when they see the love you have for each other." I'm sure it was poignant then. I'm sure it meant something then. But can you imagine reflecting on these final words, these final phrases, after the betrayal goes down, after the crucifixion goes down, like holding on to, okay, well, we still have a mission and a purpose. And what Jesus has asked us to do is to make our lives a mark of other-centered love. That's pretty cool. And it's revolutionary. At no time in history had any other leader said, "Let this be the mark of you following me." Military strength and training had been a request. Little stuff like, look like this, talk like this, eat like this, make these things the mark of you being my disciple. But never in history had a leader said, "Let this be the mark of your belonging to me, of you being ready for my kingdom. Let it be sacrificial, other-centered love." Okay, I start to get sold on this guy. I start to think that he's different.
This one's different.
Yes. Now, in the last couple minutes, and by the way, jump in if I'm skipping stuff. But in the last couple minutes, I want to just reemphasize how different this was for the culture. Starting at least back in the days of Homer, which was like 800 years BCE, we have record of this honor culture that was super, super strong in the Greeks, and then got a little facelift, but was just as strong in the Roman Empire. Oh, you know what? Before I get into that, I forgot to put chat up. So please, let's take a second of commercial break and get Chad up on here. Hi, Delia. Hi, Tim. Hi, Jim. You're loud enough now, Jim says. All right. Here's Chad. Chad, welcome. Thank you so much for being patient back there while I just got really intense. And let me give you this solo layout. Tell us who our First Century sponsor is this evening.
I am so excited about the sponsor tonight. Tonight's video is brought to you by our friends at Alleluia Plumbing. Well, it's happened again. You're the leader of the most powerful country in the world, and you've surrounded yourself with the best people, only the wisest advisors. And those advisors have gone and tricked you into passing a law that almost resulted in the terrible death of one of your closest friends, Daniel. Thankfully, everything's turned out okay, but now you're trying to think about how to punish those sneaky wise men. You're not an unreasonable man. You're thinking that maybe you'll have them all executed, and for good measure, you'll pass an edict to turn their houses into public restrooms. And to make all those new public restrooms, you're going to need the help of a good plumber. So you call your scribe and demand he pick up the phone and call Alleluia Plumbing at 650-787-1959. Yes, plumbing can be a tricky thing. Whether Moses has backed everything up like one half of the Red Sea, or your cup of blessings keeps running over, or your water keeps disappearing because the Lord is punishing your neighbors for their temples and groves, Alleluia Plumbing has the experienced professionals for the job. Guaranteed to be the only service professionals who can deal with your aqueducts and chamber pots, and rated #1 plumber in Monarchs Monthly for turning your enemies' houses into public works projects. Call Alleluia Plumbing today, and they will set up first-time customers with a 10% discount. That's Alleluia Plumbing, for when you'd rather not have that kind of living water.
Oh. Oh my goodness. All right. Chad, this was our last commercial, wasn't it?
This, unfortunately, is our last commercial. Yeah, we didn't have anybody else sign up for spots, but it's been so much fun being the radio announcer.
Yeah. Well, you've got the voice and the hair for it. Thank you for being with us for this journey. If you guys appreciated Chad O'Reed, give him a little smiley emoji. And if you didn't, give him a frowny emoji or a poop one because of Alleluia. But Chad, thank you so much for using your creative arts to enrich our program. Appreciate you. All right, back to my rampage that I got on and did not want to look away for a half a second. Okay, so back to this honor culture. In his book, Charities and Social Aid in Greece and Rome, A.R. Hands, fun last name, A.R. Hands discusses the common sentiments associated with giving and honor in this book. He says, in the records of time, the motive which is constantly ascribed to the donor by the recipient, and indeed asserted by the donor himself, are these words, he says, called philotimia or philodoxia. And that means love of honor and love of glory. He says that these concepts are just so integral to the reason why anybody did anything in Grecian culture and in Roman culture, that you would, and it wasn't like a bad thing. Like we talk about, our motives for giving, we want to have a good heart about them, but that wasn't necessarily important in this time. And it was fine to love personal honor. It was fine to love personal glory. And of course, there are situations in literature where you see these things getting away and someone will say like, okay, well, they just had too much of it. But for the most part, wanting to set yourself up, for success involved building and guarding and even fighting for, unto the death, your honor. And this kind of encompasses several ideas. Your personal honor and your personal glory are everything from just your good name and reputation to your ambition to what kind of respect you deserve when you're out and around. And one of the writers, it was the same guy, A.R. Hands, he says that if you were, say, like at a dinner party or hanging out with people, you try to hang out with people who have the same level of honor that you did. But if you happen to be kind of one of the lucky ones up and coming and you were hanging out with these guys, it would not be unusual for you to get a small portion of whatever it is. Like we try to serve everyone the same amount or treat everyone pretty equally, but that would be unheard of. Mostly the more honor you had, you got 3 to 5 times the preferential treatment as somebody who had lower honor than you did, or even slightly. And so it's just kind of a weird, not that you were necessarily born into it, but it did get into a class and a caste system based on your family's honor and your family's glory. So also another interesting thing that he brings up is that your family's honor and glory was used a lot of times by officials to guilt you into continuing to give to public works and public projects. So even though like the citizenry was giving and donating, like
No, that I was not aware of.
you would be shamed. Yeah, you would be shamed if you did not act befitting the honor and glory that you already had. So once you get there, maintaining it is a whole nother situation. In Rome, these ideas were further developed. It's worth everything. The lingo changed a little bit. Some of the words changed a little bit, but the idea was the same. Dignitas was the influence a male citizen acquired throughout his life. It included his personal reputation, moral standing, and ethical worth, along with a man's entitlement to respect and proper treatment, owing to the reputation and standing of his family. In his book, Empire of Honor, The Art of Government in the Roman World, J.E. Linden explains that it was a necessary part of the government and that this or that could come and go, but that there were certain things that had to be in place for the Roman Empire to continue ruling, expanding, and being in charge like they were. And one of those things was this honor culture. I'll sum up this idea, this thought, in a comment from Cicero, who said, it is quite clear that most people are generous in their gifts, not so much by natural inclination as by reason of the lure of honor. They simply want to be seen as beneficent. So in this time, in these folks' life, the motivating factor to give or to love or to take care of people was their personal honor, or by extension, their family's honor. And that's one of the reasons why the things that Jesus said were so revolutionary and were so world-changing. Professor Gary Ferngren at Oregon State University makes the case that benevolence in the ancient world was not only lacking, but even frowned upon, and that the introduction of these ideas that Christ was bringing to the table, like the value of every individual, the need to show sacrificial agape love, and social responsibility that went beyond just yourself, your family, or your small group of friends, kind of kicked off what we now take for granted as right and morally acceptable in the Western world. So huge ideas. And that's what made Jesus' love revolutionary. He didn't talk about loving for your honor or your glory. He talked about loving because God had already loved you, loving despite honor or glory of that individual. And that is the thing that would give glory to God. So those things were pretty fresh on the scene and not things that were normal. This set off a chain reaction, as we read from some of the quotes earlier. Hospitals, orphanages, public assistance, funds helping people bury their dead if they couldn't afford it. All of these things were supposed to be direct results of the teachings of Jesus. I'll leave it here tonight. Philippians 2:3-8. Paul is advising church members in Philippi on how to live like Jesus. And it says, verse 3, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Now, I know a lot of those things would be contested, but the point I want to leave you with is this. Jesus' love and servant leadership was revolutionary, by any stretch of the imagination. And even more so, if you can get on board with the divinity of Christ, which we're going to talk a little bit more about tomorrow morning. So even outside his potential or claim to divinity, here was a man who revolutionized what it meant to love and seek honor and glory. All right, that's it for tonight, my friends. Thank you so much for joining us. Hi, Baldy Life. Hi, Jim. Thank you guys so much for your happy responses toward Chad. And we are meeting again tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. I think we'll be here. We'll be here. Depends on how loud it is. We hope you enjoyed that delightful piano music from inside. But that's it for us tonight. Please join us again tomorrow, 9:30 a.m. right here. And if you're subscribed, I'll send the links out. I'll see you guys tomorrow morning, where Mark will be presenting on
Son of God or Son of Man?
Son of God or Son of Man, a look at what Jesus thought about himself and a case for...
And what he said about himself.
And what he said about himself. Okay. See, I don't know very much. I'm just going along with it. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll end this broadcast now, but if you have any other comments, you can send them to me at askachristianfriend@gmail.com. And we thank you for hanging out with us tonight. Bye for now.
Good night.